Episode 13 of the WildFed podcast, Saving the Atlantic Salmon with Catherine Schmitt, is brought to you by Surthrival. Surthrival's new line of nutraceutically advanced, organically produced CBD products are selling out fast, and that's because they work. The formula is called CBD3 because it's made from 3 CBD extracts combined into one. First is a powerful, scientifically validated, nano-delivered CBD that's designed to get into your cells fast. Then a thoroughly researched and scientifically studied liposomally delivered CBD that stays in the body substantially longer than other formulas. And third is a traditionally made broad-spectrum hemp extract with all the benefits of the cannabis plant minus the THC. CBD3 is studied, lab-tested for purity, and delivers faster results that last longer. Surthrival is so much more than just CBD, so go over to surthrival.com to see the entire lineup. Surthrival is empowerment fuel. Hey, for those of you that ordered season 1 of the WildFed TV show, you received episode 3 yesterday. That episode's called Salad Sauvage, Salvage, and Salmonids. It's a trip I took to the Maine North Woods in pursuit of 3 fish from the salmon family, and along the way, I harvest several plant species to use in an all-wild salad and even salvaged a white-tailed deer that had been freshly killed in a highway collision. It's a really cool and approachable episode. If you aren't currently subscribed to the show, go over to wild-fed.com to purchase season 1. 3 episodes are available to watch today, and you'll receive a new episode each Monday until all 8 episodes have been released. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. Today's episode is with Catherine Schmitt, author of The President's Salmon, a book that details how for 80 years the first Atlantic salmon caught in Maine's Penobscot River each year would be sent to the White House to be prepared for and eaten by the sitting U.S. president, a tradition that began under President William Howard Taft and continued right up to the presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush, eventually concluding with their listing under the Endangered Species Act. That narrative forms the backdrop for the big history story of the Atlantic salmon themselves, their fascinating natural history, complex life history, and the short-sighted human-induced decline that eventually led to the federal protections that are still in place today. Next Tuesday, I'll be sitting down with Richard Zane of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to discuss how the federal government allots funds to the states for conservation and field work, and how that money is derived from the sale of things like firearms, ammunition, and hunting equipment. Many people don't realize how all this works, and it's a very eye-opening experience to peer behind the curtain. Now, prepare to learn all about the king of fish, the Atlantic salmon, from the well-spoken and articulate Catherine Schmitt. Okay, I am deeply invested in geeking out on salmon today. And I just want to say up front, we are not talking about West Coast salmon, which elicits even more geekdom in me because I'm so tired of talking about those Western salmon. We're here with Catherine Schmitt. Do you go by Catherine?
Yes.
All right, I go by Daniel, and so many people can't handle that. Do people want to abbreviate you all the time?
I know, Dan.
Yeah.
Oh, it drives me crazy. Yeah, it's like when people call me Dan, it's like how hard is it to say the rest? I first came up, and I'm also here with Grant Giuliano, who you just
got
heard
it pretty
there.
good that time.
Yeah, I know. I'm working on your last name. We're getting there, episode by episode. I came across your book in the Portland airport, and immediately I did like a head snap, grabbed this thing up, and it was one of those books where I didn't put it down until it was done, so.
Nice to hear.
Great writing. And just tell us a little bit about who you are and what your background is and how you came to write this book.
Sure. So The President's Salmon, restoring the king of fish and its home waters, evolved out of a lot of research and writing that I'd been doing on the Penobscot River. I moved to Maine in 2001 to go to graduate school at the University of Maine.
Where'd you come out of?
I had been living in Maryland at the time, working on science publications related to the Chesapeake Bay restoration.
Okay. You like blue crab?
I love blue crab.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Man, when they bring you that mallet and that, where they bring you the mallet and you have the big piece of paper laid out?
Yeah, I was a vegetarian, and when I moved, I was living on the Eastern Shore in Maryland. There's not a lot of food options, and I was surrounded, I had people tonging for oysters right out my back door, and surrounded by crab and other seafood, and so I
It broke you.
It broke me.
Welcome back. I did a 10-year vegan stint, so
Yeah.
I feel you.
So when I finished school, I was working as a research assistant, doing some science communication. And at that time, the Penobscot River Restoration Project had just been announced. And some of the scientists I was working with were concerned about they wanted a lot of science done before the restoration happened so that they could really document success. The Edwards Dam removal on the Kennebec River had just happened in 1999, and there was not a lot of study before the dam removal in terms of fish numbers and ecology of the river. And scientists, the researchers didn't want to miss another opportunity to document
it, yeah.
To document the impact of dam removal. And the Penobscot Project was one of the largest in the world.
For people who aren't from Maine or New England,
Yeah.
and maybe are far flung, there'll be people in Australia and the UK and out west of the States, Canada, who are maybe don't know the importance of the Penobscot
Sure.
and the role that it plays, and also the role it's played in the story of damming and dam removal.
Sure. So the Penobscot River is the largest watershed in Maine. It's the second largest watershed in New England, so after the Connecticut River. So it's a 8,750 square mile watershed. It takes up almost a third of the state of Maine. It extends up the center of the state to the Canadian border in the west, to the Canadian border in the east, encompasses all of Mount Katahdin, and so the highest
Sort of
point.
forks right around.
Yeah, it's sort of a
right?
funnel shaped
So Katahdin all
watershed.
drains down to either
Katahdin,
side of the
yes.
west and the east branch.
Yes. So a lot of mountains. It's mostly forested. There's some agricultural land in the watershed, but it's mostly forested. And the forest has supported the economy of the watershed since the 1700s. And so it was extensively logged. It was the timber harvesting, and then later for paper making, logging. Bangor was the lumber capital of the world. So a lot of that timber was shipped out via the Penobscot River and its tributaries. So it was a major lumber exporting, way of transporting logs and lumber and shipping it. And cutting continued throughout the 1800s. So like 250 million board feet of lumber.
Wow.
Traveled down the Penobscot River, and that gave rise to all of the communities that are on the Penobscot River. It's also home to the Penobscot Nation, who's been here for 12,000 years or more. It's the center of their homeland. And it's the estuary.
Does the Penobscot Nation comprise multiple tribal groups, or is that one tribal group?
It's one tribal group.
Okay.
And their homeland is the Penobscot River,
Yep.
all of the islands in the Penobscot River, and their primary reserve lands are Indian Island,
Okay.
just north of Old Town, Maine.
Okay.
Historically, they extended much broader, a little bit to the Kennebec, and then a little bit, they were allied with the Passamaquoddies to
Okay.
the east.
Okay, got it.
So collectively, it's the Wabanaki
Okay,
territory.
right. I understood.
So it has a lot of sort of superlatives and significance. The bay, Penobscot River, drains into Penobscot Bay, which is the largest estuary in Maine, one of the largest estuaries on the east coast of the United States. It has a major influence on the Gulf of Maine in terms of freshwater input and influence on the circulation of the entire Gulf of Maine. So it's a pretty significant river system.
And the situation with the dams here?
So as soon as people started building towns and extracting resources, they started building dams, and dam construction began in the 1770s to power sawmills to make lumber,
Okay.
to build things.
Okay.
And you can follow dam construction up the river from the coastal communities, which were the first to be settled by European colonists, and then it just kind of moved upriver as more and more timber was extracted. And so at the peak, there were over 1,000 dams, including everything from a little log driving dam made out of logs and stones to eventually major concrete barriers.
I know I've waylaid us already from
That's
your
okay.
initial
No,
introduction,
that's
but
okay.
I was talking with my wife last night, and she's a school teacher, and literacy is her thing, and ecology is something that she's sort of learning about, through the course of our relationship. And And so she'll ask me questions sometimes that I'll be like, oh, I haven't thought about that. And she was asking me yesterday, when they started damming the river, what were they thinking about with regard to migratory fish? And I was explaining to her, well, they definitely knew about the migratory fish because they were obviously a very important food source to pre-Columbian peoples, and then afterwards they were as well. So what was, if I know you don't have the crystal ball, but if you had the Wayback Machine, what was the thinking then when they obviously knew these fish ran up the rivers?
Well, so different people were thinking different things.
Yeah, of course.
So the people who were building the dams were thinking, there's so many fish in the river, this one dam can't possibly have an impact on all of this fish. And the early dams were really leaky, so salmon especially could get through them. So other fish were actually more affected immediately than salmon, because salmon are so strong and mighty that they could make their way up. If there's any little bit of water, they could get through a dam that had gaps in it or channels and things. But pretty early on, as early as like 1820, you start to see written petitions to the Maine state legislature complaining about the effects that dams were having on the fish. And the Penobscot Nation were the first to submit such petitions. And they're in the Maine State Archives. You can go and unroll. They're like these big scrolls that have dozens or hundreds of signatures on them.
Oh, wow.
So the Penobscots were protesting that the dams were affecting their ability to gather salmon and other fish for food. And then you also saw people were also harvesting fish commercially and selling them to make a living, as well as harvesting for their own food. And those people in communities up and down the lower Penobscot were submitting petitions to the legislature, protesting about dams and their effect on fish. And what you see over time in looking at those petitions and reactions of government is that government consistently and continuously has favored the logging industry and the paper industry.
Because of their deeper interest in the economy, I would assume, right? So it's always coming down to, this is where the money's coming from.
Yep. And the timber interests, they were the powerful, fat cats in the state of Maine.
They own a significant amount of the land here, do they not?
They own the land. And they owned the government in a sense of having control over the legislature. So historian Richard Judd has written extensively about the sort of grassroots conservationist ethos of farmers and fishermen and country sort of people in Maine and elsewhere.
Probably a good moment to take us back now
Sure.
to where you were.
Sure.
I'm sorry I pulled you so far off course. And you were talking about moving here from Maryland.
Yeah, and the Penobscot River Restoration Project, which got us on the topic of dams. So the proposal to remove two major dams, the first two, if you're coming from the ocean, the first two dams on the river, major dams that went all the way across the main stem, were proposed for removal. A bypass around a third major dam, rebalancing of hydropower so they wouldn't lose any electric generating capacity. So it was this sort of really grand vision of a project.
Paid for in part by all entities involved, or paid for by industry?
No, it was paid for by a nonprofit sort of trust of various conservation organizations, including the Penobscot Nation Trout Unlimited, Maine Audubon, Natural Resources Council of Maine, several other groups that came together
to
raise funding for the project.
That's amazing.
To actually buy the dams. So they paid to buy the dams so that they could then take them out.
Wow.
So this was exciting, and so I, as a research assistant, got some grant money to sort of start to pull together a bibliography of historic research that had been done on the river, thinking scientists were going to be really studying this. This project is going to be a big deal. I can help them by pulling together a literature review and organizing information. So what had been done on water quality, what has been done on wildlife, what's been done on vegetation and wetlands on the river.
So you're doing like a literature review. Review. Was there quite a bit of excitement around this project at the time?
Oh, yes, very much.
So there's a lot of energy pulsing through it.
Yes. And so over the course of that project, I ended up working with scientists who were getting together to develop a plan for monitoring the river before and after dam removal. And then at the same time, I was doing a lot of freelance journalism. And I was writing a lot of stories about the Penobscot River, stories about pollution, stories about conservation and development. And that just sort of turned into me wanting to pull it together into a book about the Penobscot River.
Okay, got it. I am curious too. I saw a photograph of you with a fly rod and a salmon, so I assume that you angle at some level.
I do, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
One of the stories that I did when I was freelancing, so I did some stories for Atlantic Salmon Journal, and there was a fly tying class offered here by Penobscot fly fishers in the winter, and so I took the course and wrote about it and wrote an article in Atlantic Salmon Journal.
You hadn't fished.
I had not.
This.
I had fished. I had not fly fished.
Okay.
I learned how to tie flies, and then I learned how to tie flies, and then I took a rod building course.
Oh, fantastic!
So I learned how to tie flies. I wrote that article, and then I took a rod building course and built a rod, fiberglass, not bamboo or anything. Yeah. And so then I wanted to go catch a fish. So we have some fly fishing friends, and they took me out on the east outlet of Moosehead Lake, the Kennebec, awesome. And went and caught a landlocked Atlantic salmon on the fly with a rod I built myself and a fly I tied
That felt
myself.
good, huh?
It felt awesome.
Oh,
yeah.
Great. There's a big smile in that picture.
Yes.
I want to pull us off course again. I really want to come back to salmon, and that's where I want to focus, but I have a side interest developing in the eels, in the eel fishery, the American eel. And I read an article that you wrote about it, and I just wanted to push in there for a moment because I feel like these two topics have some overlap. Obviously, one's an anadromous fish and one's a catadromous fish, and they have very different stories, but we are in the process of collapsing. From what I can tell, it looks like we're collapsing a fishery from what I'm reading about it. I mean, I don't have an in-depth knowledge of it, but I'm curious what you think about what's going on in the state right now with the glass eel fishery, and do you think this is something that can be sustained? And I'm piling the questions up. I do this all the time. With the age of these fish, by the time they go out to spawn, it seems to me there's like delay in seeing what the impacts of the glass eel fishery is. So I guess, could you start just explain a little bit to people listening? They're like, what is he talking about with these eels? And if you could just give a little primer on the eels, and then I'd just love to hear what you think about it, because it's a subject I'm exploring and want to explore more on the show.
Sure, and there is a connection to salmon, so I'll make the connection. So I don't think we know enough about the adult eel population in general to have any idea what kind of impact the Elver fishery is having on the population. Yep. We just don't know. There have been petitions to list American eel on the endangered species list.
Citizen-based ones,
yes,
from what I understand.
That have not been successful, and I think it's because of a lack of data. So we don't know.
It looks like the government was very hesitant to want to accept some of that data, from what I can tell as well. Understandably, I know ESA puts a lot of pressure, again, back on the economy, which I know the state must be terrified of. I can't imagine the impact of eels being, especially federally listed, where they have such a huge range.
Right.
The impacts would be so dramatic. I can see why they would want to just push it to the side. But I think in the rule book, you can still catch 25 eels, which is a pretty generous bag limit compared to other fish in the state.
Per day?
Yeah.
Jeez.
25 a
But
day.
I don't know how many people are actually
Not many.
doing that.
Not many.
So the Elver fishery, the two of the biggest problems with it are
Tell people what these elvers are, too.
So they're juvenile eels.
Okay.
So eels are born in the Sargasso Sea, which is in
We're pretty sure.
We're pretty sure. And they hatch and they sort of find their way to freshwater rivers as babies. And as they drift with the currents. And then as they kind of approach where rivers meet the sea, they start to smell and pick up. They sense somehow fresh water, which is where they want to be. And so they migrate up. They sort of drift into. They don't return. So there's no fidelity to like the river. They're not necessarily going to the same river where their parents were, but they're finding a freshwater river. And by the time they enter rivers, they've grown several inches long, and they've gone from a little transparent larvae to a glass-like tiny baby eel. So they're clear, you can see through them, and they have tiny black eyes, and they migrate with the tides, usually at night, depending on lunar cycles. And they make their way sort of up the edges of rivers. And that's where they are captured, intercepted by nets, these fyke nets, which are funnel-shaped nets that you can see lining the rivers in March and early April, all over coastal Maine. We're one of 2 states that has a commercial fishery for glass eels.
Is that the 25 eel limit bag?
No, that's for adult eels.
Okay.
So the eels are fished when they're babies, and they're shipped alive to Asia, where they go into ponds, aquaculture ponds, and they're raised to the adult stage, and then they go into the sushi market. So that's the big problem, is that we're taking baby fish here and shipping them halfway across the world to be raised into adults, and then we somewhere some of them make it back onto our plates. But
and correct me if I'm wrong, but that's following on the heels of sort of the collapse of the Japanese eel fishery,
of eels all over the world.
European eel fishery.
Yes,
we had the kind of last good holdout.
Right.
Is South Carolina that has an eel? Okay, but their glass eel fishery is much smaller than ours, if I understand it.
Right.
And most of them are coming out of Maine, and so we're currently denuding our eel population to feed our sushi habits.
Right.
That's getting a lot of attention with bluefin.
Yes.
And guilty. I like bluefin. I like to eat bluefin.
I like unagi too.
But like in good faith, like my consumption has gone way down. I really like unagi, and then I start learning about this and realizing like what a weird story, as you mentioned, because Sargasso's down by the Bermuda Triangle, right? So then they come all the way up with the currents, they end up in Maine, they get sold into the Chinese market, they end up in the Japanese market, some of them come back here, we eat them in our sushi places.
So one thing that's happening to close that loop and make it a little tighter and more local is, rather than shipping them, and I think it's probably fine to harvest some, right?
Oh yeah.
Is to learn the technology to raise them to adulthood here. And that is being done. So Sarah Rademacher started American Unagi, and she is raising eels successfully. And it is one of the best things I've ever eaten in my life.
Oh, I bet.
It's absolutely incredible.
Where's she out of?
It melts in your mouth. She's mid-coast, Damerscott area.
Cool. That's neat.
And she's mid-coast.
The current part of what scares me is the market value of them.
So that's the other problem, is the price. So the fishery wouldn't be so crazy. Like, it's crazy. Like, there's like violence involved. I mean,
imagine.
It's a pretty crazy fishery.
Sells
and
at
that's because
prices.
they're $2,000-$3,000 a pound.
Yeah. Do we have any regulation on the glass eel fishery?
Yeah, there is. So there's quotas, and there's all kinds of systems. I mean, because we're talking about huge amounts of cash being exchanged at night on the riverbanks. And so they've shifted out of, so there's no cash. It's all like these card transactions, and there's been a lot of restriction on it. And then, but the price influences it. So
when I was doing research on it, I was looking for people to interview on the topic, and I came across, I was like, oh, this guy seems good. He was at DMR, and he helped develop the regulation, blah, blah, blah. And then I keep reading about him, and it's like, oh, he's in prison. He was caught selling them black market. Like, what a deep story this thing is. And I guess because I think a lot about what the market, I love to hunt, I love to fish, and I'm not against people doing that at any level. No, at many levels. But at some levels, like the whaling industry level, right? Or the market hunts, like with bison or beaver that trade for making hats, like what we did there. The passenger pigeon, like, wow, extinct now. Our cod fishery collapsed, right? Like, it took probably 500 years, but we did it. And now I'm like, oh, the eels, the salmon, which we're going to be talking about.
It's scale. It's all about scale. So anytime you try to take a wild food and harvest it and commodify it at that scale, it's not sustainable.
Because I like what you said. You sort of concluded in your article, you were saying that it was, I'm paraphrasing you, so correct me if I put this in a way that doesn't feel accurate to you, but you were saying something along the lines of it's nice to see the nets out in the water,
Yeah.
like people work in the river, which is like, I really agree with that, you know, but then I get worried, like, well, what's 30 years look like? You know, I know they've been doing this since the 70s, and the population seems to be diminishing throughout its entire range. So do you think that we should be doing this, or do you think we should be restricting it more, or do you feel not like comfortable to make a sort of statement one way or the other?
I think we should be doing it at the appropriate scale.
Yeah.
And I think part of the problem, the Elver fishery is like a gold rush fishery.
Yeah.
And so restricting licenses so that if you fish for, you can't get in and out of the fishery depending on what the price is, which is how it's been. And so making it so that it is more of, if you fish for eel, you do it every year, no matter what the price or something. And so that you do have that culture of stewardship, because people are thinking ahead to future years. But the link to salmon with eels and why it's okay for us to be talking about eels is that unlike in the Pacific, there's all these different species of salmon, and it drives the culture, it drives the history. It's such a strong presence. And sometimes we think about Atlantic salmon and like we don't have as salmon-centric a culture, both indigenous culture and Euro culture. And that's because we had, instead of 6 different salmonids, we have 12 species of sea-run fish. And so salmon are the only salmon species, but then we have eel, elver, eel, shad, alewife, blueback herring, striped bass. Instead, we have this sturgeon. We have this broader array
of fish coming in and out.
Because
it's interesting when you think about our major rivers, like the idea how permeable they are to these migrating fish, and that it's not as simple as like a discrete freshwater, saltwater, because we have fish moving both ways.
All the time.
Fascinating. Mm-hmm. So cool. The impacts of the dams, like for the eels when they're leaving, correct? And with the salmon, it's when they're coming back, right?
Well, baby eels, I mean, they can squirm if they have traction, but the larger concrete dams, they could have a hard time. And the adults get chopped up in turbines as they're migrating out.
Because it's interesting, it seems like when we're talking about like all of these species I just mentioned, that there's been collapses, big part of it's been the commercial harvest, but another big part of it is changes to the landscape, built environments, damming, pollution, right? Loss of habitat. With the salmon, it's like been a bit of all of that, right? There's all of these factors are at play.
It's been a bit of all of it. Yeah.
This fish, the salmon, so it's Salmo salar, right? I don't know, before I read your book, I don't know if I had fully just grasped. I grew up in the void, the salmon void. And I didn't understand that this fish had been so important in the so-called old world, was also so important in the new world, that when people talked about salmon throughout time, they were pretty much talking about this fish. And even today, if we go buy farmed salmon, it's Atlantic salmon, right? I mean, I think there's a perception that it must be better salmon over in the West, which is why I was sort of teasingly joking about them in the beginning. Obviously, I think they're amazing species. But for me growing up, salmon was always this West Coast phenomenon. And as I learned more, I realized that there's that sort of gap it's that shifting baseline, And so can you tell us a little bit historically, maybe about the natural history of this fish to help people appreciate how much the baseline has shifted on this species?
Sure. So salmon range from northeastern North America all the way across the Atlantic to Russia, Scandinavia, as far south as Portugal historically. Wow. So that was their range. And so if you think about salmon and all of those other species of migratory fish that we were just talking about, salmon are really big. They're really nutritious. And so they're a little bit more oily. And so they were really highly prized and valued of those fish. Like they were the best food.
Best eating in the rivers,
fish. In general. So they were really highly valued. And they are born in freshwater. They spend a couple years there. They migrate out to the ocean, to the sort of subarctic region, where they spend a couple years growing big and fat and feeding, and then they return home to spawn in freshwater to the very same stream where they were born. So they're migratory. So they come back typically right around now, April.
And I don't want to
May.
I don't want to spoil it for people, but because I'd like to bring it up later, I think it fits into the story so neatly somewhere else. But like with what we were talking about eels and where they spawn, for a long time we didn't know where the salmon were going, right? When they leave, and that mystery probably helped their population stay intact for some time.
Well, it certainly, because we weren't fishing for them in the ocean. So imagine, you're spending all winter, your food stores are running low, everything you've dried and put away is running out. It's March, it's lean, there's not a lot of wild food out there. And right about that time, the fish start coming back.
So about now, you're saying?
Right about now.
So you get done the maple syrup, you get done cooking off sugar, and then they're starting to roll in.
The fish come in. And so it was miraculous. Every year the fish returned just when people needed food the most. And so that's why salmon figures so prominently in story and culture and myth and memory. That was one of my favorite parts of writing the book, was researching all of the different cultures around the world and the stories and rituals that they have around salmon.
I watched a talk you had given, and you were talking about how there's similar features in these rituals that would take place. You want to describe some of that? So
some are first fish rituals. So a lot of the inspiration for the stories and rituals is this fact that the salmon seem to appear out of nowhere like magic, and we don't know where they come from, but there they are every year. Also the strength of the fish and its power, so they can leap like 12 feet. I mean, they're really powerful fish. And so seeing them ascend rapids and waterfalls inspired people to make up stories and myths about this fish. The idea that the salmon kind of holds wisdom and is an embodiment of sort of mystery and the divine and spirit is because of the nature of the fish and sort of its behavior. So the fish coming back, there's first fish rituals all around the world for not just salmon, but other fish. So New Zealand has a first fish ritual. And so because salmon have this habit of migrating and appearing in cultures throughout their range, the first fish is treated as a special thing. And so sometimes the fish is harvested and prepared and celebrated in a certain way and then returned to the river so it can sort of find its way home again. In other cases, the first fish is reserved for a royal person like the king or a leader or certain people. So, there's various elements of the first fish, but it is a common theme around the world.
Yeah. I wonder if some of those, because when you were describing some of the attributes that people had ascribed to the fish, it sounds similar also in the West, right, to the Pacific salmon as well. So, yeah, it's like what it inspires in the human psyche is similar. I imagine outside of sort of, you were talking about the Penobscots and their use of it and of that resource, and then the Europeans were using it on their in the European continent, and I assume in Iceland as well, right? So it was like a fish that, it was one species that when they crossed over here, they were like, well, we know that one. And I imagine its habits were quite similar.
Yeah, so they recognize salmon, and so they immediately started fishing for it.
Well. Did you say that the Penobscots were more spearing it?
That was their traditional method of catching salmon, was with a wooden spear from a canoe, usually at night, at that first set of falls and rapids.
Do we have any artifacts left of those tools that they use for that?
There's salmon spears.
Where could I see those?
So there is a salmon spear at the Abbey Museum in Bar Harbor.
All right, I'm going.
And there's a great sculpture of a man spearing on Indian Island that you can see. It's out for, you can see it accessible to the public. And you also might, while you're here, you might run by the Hudson Museum. They had the spear and then it ended up at the Abbey. So, but they may have one there as well.
Okay.
And there are some photos.
This fish is connected, I always read, in some way to the last glaciation, and that it's adapted to that environment that was created right after that. Can you describe that?
Yeah, so salmon are a northern fish, so they're a cold water fish, so they like it cold. And if you look at their range is essentially the part of the northern hemisphere that has been under an ice sheet at, periodically throughout the last, hundreds of thousands of years. And salmon themselves are some 250, our species of salmon is 250,000 years old. And so their lineage is much older than that. And so they have survived as a species through multiple glaciations. And so they sort of migrate north and south and like the edge of the ice. So they spawn in gravel. So they need sort of really fast running water and cold water
A lot of oxygen,
that has
I
a lot of
imagine.
oxygen in it. And that's the kind of condition that's created by a glacier. And so their spawning habitat they're adapted to that kind of glacially scoured and sculpted environment in cold water.
I'm curious. I'll see if I can find the limits of your memory recall, which is astounding, by the way. At some point, there's a divergence from the brown trout because they share a genus. Oh, you get the book. Oh, I love this. Because I've been endlessly fascinated with this question of what's a trout and what's a salmon? Because the rainbow trout shares the genus, of course, with all of the Pacific salmon. And then the brown trout shares the genus with the Atlantic salmon. And they can be easy to tell apart or very difficult to tell apart, of course. And it can get confusing. But I'm trying to dig into this story a little bit of where the trout and salmon divergence is and why trout aren't considered salmon and then why are char considered trout. It gets all very confusing.
Yeah, so I'm trying to find that.
Take your time and we can edit space.
I did do look at all the genetics papers. And one thing is that it's constantly changing. So people are studying and constantly shifting species around. But they do have the DNA sort of mapped out. So Eosamo is the common descendant of all.
Okay. Of all of the salmonids?
Yes.
Wow.
Yep.
All the adipose finned
That might be
fish.
easier.
I knew we'd get to the bottom of this eventually.
I've heard you ask this a
So
couple
many times,
times.
right? I've been digging.
So
in.
is it in the book? I think it's
I have a note in your
In
book
here.
actually where I was like, "What's up?" This is a while back that I had read it, but I made a note what's a brown trout then? What's the difference between a trout and a salmon?
I mean, I can show you. I'll have to look it up, but I have the map that shows the splits.
Oh, cool.
And who's
Yeah.
related to who and how it all splits
maybe
out.
you could send that to me
Maybe we could
sometime.
link
I'd
to
be
that.
curious. Yeah, we'll put a link up for it. But it is interesting because the brown trout and which is here now due to stocking programs, but is a fish of the old world, is now here with the Atlantic salmon in the way that it was in Europe. And I always just find that weird when there's we just can't live here without the brown trout. It's what about
Okay.
the brook trout? They're great.
So the common ancestor is 50 million years old.
Okay.
So 50 million years ago, the fossil fish, that's how old it is. So that's grayling, whitefish, cisco, lennox, hutchin, trout, char.
Smelts even, I think, probably, huh?
Salmon family.
Yeah.
And then Atlantic and Pacific salmon split 30 million years ago.
Okay.
And then European and Atlantic split 250,000 years ago.
Okay, so the European salmon
Yeah.
and the salmon here are not both salmocellar?
They are, but
They're
they're
subspecies.
Yeah.
Do you know the trinomial by any chance?
I think it's no, I don't. No.
Okay. Found it.
Yeah.
That's all right. So I didn't realize that too. So genetically distinct populations.
Yes.
But they do.
And our Maine salmon are genetically distinct. So Penobscot salmon are genetically
okay.
distinct from Machias salmon.
Right. Because they return to the same waters,
Right.
therefore they're sort of
Right.
isolated populations.
And that was a subject of a major National Academy of Sciences study because there was a lot of controversy when salmon were listed as an endangered species. People trying to say that they're, they're runts, they're hybrid fish, they're derived from hatchery. They're not really truly
looking for a reason to circumvent regulation.
Yes.
Okay.
But there was extensive study of their DNA to show that they are, in fact, genetically distinct and they are wild fish.
What are your big picture thoughts on the ESA? Because growing up, it just always sounded like such a great thing to me. And then and I still think it's a very effective tool. Yeah. As I get older, it seems like every topic I'm like, oh, it's more complicated than I used to think it was. Like it's more nuanced than I used to think it was. Just curious what you think about it, because like we talked about with eels, now I see that it's not as simple as you realize an animal's in trouble and you put it on that list. And that I also have learned that the charisma of the animal seems to be a major factor in a thing getting listed too. Like I think eels have a real bad PR campaign. There's nothing really that people like so much about them.
Even though we do
slimy and slippery.
Even though we like sushi.
Yeah, if somebody was like, pandas are in trouble, it'd be like, oh my God, the pandas! So.
Well, I think the Endangered Species Act is one of the most incredible and powerful pieces of environmental legislation in the world.
Cool. All right.
And countries around the world have tried to model it. And you it's powerful when there is so much energy trying to dismantle it and continually weaken the act. And it's powerful when people resist attempts to weaken or dismantle the Endangered Species Act. And it does work because it's prevented most species, species from going extinct. And what it does is it gives, it is the job of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, of the U.S. federal government, to prevent a plant, animal, organism from going extinct. And that's the kind of, stewardship and care and reciprocity towards nature that we all should have.
Yeah. Man, I mean, we were just talking yesterday about when I was a kid, seeing a bald eagle was mostly something that happened on any kind of federal document that I saw, but not outside. And now I see them
all the
on
time.
like a pretty regular basis.
Still cool though.
It's every time I just want to be, we have that piece of footage where I'm like, eagle, bald eagle! One of the episodes we made. I get so excited about it. The bleak part of this story, I think, maybe comes next. And what happened from that? Well, actually, first, maybe, what kind of abundance were we experiencing here? Because you hear these stories, and it's that shifting baseline. I mean, I feel like species, whatever it is that you're into for species, it tends to be, the tendency is towards a story of almost an unbelievable amount of abundance in the ethnographies and, the reporting that we hear from the past. So were they like, walk across their backs, across the river type dents? Like what were we looking at?
Hey, I hope you're enjoying this episode of the WildFed podcast. I'm really excited to announce that our WildFed hats are now available. Your hat's more than just a fashion accessory. It's one of your most important pieces of hunting, fishing, and foraging equipment. Your hat shields your eyes from the sun on the landscape and glare out on the water, improving your visibility and your ability to see what you're searching for. I wasn't really a hat person before I became serious about marksmanship, hunting, and fishing. In fact, I pretty much avoided ball caps altogether. Now I almost never go into the field without one. It's just simply too important of a piece of equipment. Visually scanning the landscape or shooting under high sun without a hat brim is very frustrating. Fishing without a hat is nearly an exercise in futility, but finding a hat you love can be just as frustrating. WildFed's low-profile, trucker-style snapback hats are clean, simple, and classy. The woven label reads, WildFed. Food is all around you. We produced one in the color they call Loden, which is like a muted gray-green, and I chose it because it blends in when I'm out in the field, but it's right at home in urban environments too. And we're also offering a limited release in Hunter Orange. These hats have been very popular, and I think that's because most states and provinces require you to wear at least an orange hat during the firearm season on big game, making it a perfect companion to your hunts or just to keep you and your family safe out on the landscape during the hunting season. Again, these are extremely high quality, structured, trucker-style snapback hats, and you can find them at wild-fed.com. Go over there and have a look. Now, enjoy the second half of the show.
Yeah, so if we just think of the Penobscot, in the Penobscot alone, there was probably 100,000 fish, 100,000 salmon every year.
Wow.
The fishery was around, so they, that would have been the sort of maximum. And the numbers that we know are based on fishery numbers, commercial fishery numbers, and estimated based on that. So if we think 100,000 salmon in one river, and multiply that, so, it's probably around.
And big fish too, huh?
Big fish, yep. So they would have filled the river, but only, they came from April to July. And so the thing about all the different species of fish that are going back and forth is the river was always full of fish.
Yeah.
Right? There was always fish in the river, different fish at different times.
But they had just worked out their traffic patterns over
they work out
the millennia.
Yep. I've been trying to develop a graphic of that, and it's like, it's so hard.
How do you do it?
I still haven't been able to do it.
So what is that? What do the numbers look like now?
Yeah, so now, I can, the listeners can't see the graph. So if we think of, salmon started declining as soon as people started fishing for them, and dams were going in at that same time. So we went from 100,000. In the 19th century, it was around 10,000 fish. So 1880s, 1890s, the commercial fishery was harvesting about 10,000 salmon every year for sale, for market. So that would be late 1800s. By the turn of the 20th century, so 1900, 1910, it had dropped to about a few thousand every year.
Oh, man. That's
so
perilous.
we see an order of magnitude drop. So 2,000, 3,000 every year. And then we went down to zero. So in the middle of the 20th century, there was no fishery, and there were no salmon above Bangor in the Penobscot River.
And we're in Bangor now. How far are we from the coast? It's not far at all.
This is head of tide.
Yeah. It is.
Yep. So
Oh,
it's
I
head
didn't
of
know that.
tide.
What does that mean?
It's the limit of the tide. So Bangor, so the falls where the first dam was at the Bangor Dam, which you can see at the waterworks. You should take a drive down State Street. You can see where the first dam was at Treats Falls on the river. And so that's the limit of the tide. So we get, I think it's 8 or 9 feet here twice a day. And then you hit saltwater at Winterport. So that's about 15 miles.
Oh, okay.
You start to get into the head of the estuary,
So this is
saltwater.
This was as far as they were getting. What year was that?
So this is as far as they were getting, because the river was so polluted that estuary got deprived of oxygen because of all the pollution in the river. And so that was in the 1950s and 60s.
Okay, where my head immediately goes with that is, well, if they return to where they were born and then they can't get in there,
right,
what happens to those fish? And then if you clear all of the impediment and all the pollution, how do you get them to come back?
So the fish that can't get home have to turn around and find another river to go into.
So they'll go back out?
They'll go back out and they'll find another tributary in the estuary.
So they do have a plan B, at least, genetic plan B.
Or they die.
Yeah.
Right? They keep trying and banging their head against a wall, literally, until they die. Okay. Or they just go back out to sea and then they get eaten as they're turning around. So it's not a good thing to not be able to get home. I mean, I imagine, when you're traveling and you hit a construction detour. Yeah. Like, just imagine how irritating that is, and think of that,
Yeah, permanent.
Yeah. And then the second part of the question was, how do you get them back? So you get them back through conservation hatcheries,
where you actually place them. You place their eggs in an area and let them hatch out.
You take adult fish, and you spawn them in a
We just
building.
left the hatchery yesterday, actually, so we saw the whole process.
So that started in 1871. The Craig Brook Fish Hatchery is the first salmon hatchery in the United States, and it was started in 1871, and it hasn't changed much since 1871. They're still I swear some of those pans are still the ones that Charles Atkins used. So you spawn the fish with human assistance, and you raise the eggs, and then now what they do is they plant eggs, they raise fish until they're 6 months old, and they plant fry, they plant fish at all life stages.
Okay.
But how they were able to maintain the fish while the river wasn't healthy enough for them is raising them to smolt stage and basically putting them in the river right when they exit.
So they leave with a memory of that spot.
They leave with a memory.
It's really incredible.
Of
And then
that
they come
spot.
back to spawn.
And then, so because they're in the river, they're imprinting on the Penobscot River, and so they leave right away, but they've gotten that imprint, and so they'll remember.
And they just go as far up as they can to spawn when they come back?
Yeah.
And they find like just like a nice pocket to spawn in?
Well, theoretically,
There's a nice pocket.
theoretically, yes. So theoretically, they'll come back to the Penobscot and they'll just keep swimming, hopefully above where they were placed in the river, and they'll find a new tributary and a new home. But in reality, most of the adult fish are captured and taken to the hatchery to repeat the cycle because there's just the population is at such a low level right now that it's like it's life support.
That's
and
what
so
we're on life support right now.
Yeah, there's just not enough of them to risk them trying to go over. I mean, they still have multiple dams. So the Penobscot River Restoration Project that we were talking about was successful, but there's still 100 dams in the river.
100.
Yeah, throughout the entire watershed. So not on the main stem. And the Penobscot actually has fewer dams than other rivers of its size. So if you look now, it's actually.
How many are left? I thought it was just one left now, right? One
no.
Major, it's not. Oh.
There's still, so there's West Enfield, and then Mattaseunk at Weldon. So there's still a couple major dams.
Okay.
So there's one on the main stem and then Weldon on the West Branch.
Okay.
And lots of tributary dams.
Yeah.
There's still old log driving dams and
dams that aren't even in use, essentially.
Right.
Back to the hatchery thing. This is kind of what I was talking about before. I said I find that some things are much more nuanced than I wanted to. Hatcheries are something that I wanted to just be like stupid. And now I'm a little. We visited them and we spoke to the folks who are passionate about the work.
Yeah.
And then I'm reluctant to even pass judgment at this point, although I see some of the really awful fallout that's happened from programs like these. And one question I have based on what you were just saying was how careful were they genetically with the salmon that they were doing this with? Because genetics is a science that emerged in my lifetime.
Right.
So you went back to the 1870s. I don't think genetics were really well established then. Is this population of fish, the fish from the Penobscot?
Well, yes, they are. So Penobscot fish actually went all over. So it happened the reverse. So our fish went all over the country.
Yeah. Okay.
Our Penobscot fish were stocked everywhere because this is where the hatchery was.
I'm all like, yeah.
They put salmon on trains.
Oh,
I mean, there was a train of salmon eggs. But they definitely mixed them up. So Penobscot fish went into the other rivers in Maine. We did have there's Canadian fish genes in them. So there was a lot of mixing. They also tried to stock Pacific salmon and rainbow trout, in Maine, and brown trout. So
tried and succeeded because we have them still.
Yeah,
I mean, we just saw so many rainbow trout babies yesterday. That was one where I didn't really want to talk about that with him. I just
so you didn't go to Craig Brook Hatchery?
No, we were in New Gloucester.
Okay.
And we were
very different.
Okay, yeah. This was a very simple. I was amazed at how kind of simple the whole thing was, but it's like brown trout and rainbow trout. Like what?
Yeah.
Why?
So Craig Brook is a conservation and so now
they're doing the conservation work versus the angler.
Right. Craig Brook is a federal fish. It's U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service,
I'd like to check
and
that
it is there. So they have a separate room for every river. So now the genetics are strict. Every fish gets scanned and they have its DNA. So they have the entire lineage of all 800 fish mapped out because when they spawn them, they want to try to get as much genetic diversity as possible. And so before they do the spawning, there's a whole matchmaking, computerized matchmaking
much higher
process.
level of sophistication is going into this now.
Yes. So during the spawning, which is very wet and cold, but they've got computers there and they're actually scanning like the tags of the fish to make sure who should be mating with who. And
I'm glad to hear that.
And so every river, so that's not just the Penobscot, but there's endangered Atlantic salmon and the down east rivers, Machias, East Machias, Narragansett, Pleasant, Denny's, they all have their own separate room and facility at the hatchery.
Sounds cool.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't know that existed.
So there is some care going into this at this point.
Yeah, okay. It's as sophisticated as we have.
It's not Civil War surgery anymore.
No,
because it sounds like it was, and I mean, like what we looked at yesterday. In fairness, was more about anglers. It was about just wanting to make sure people are catching fish. which is kind of strange to me, but I kind of get it too. And anyway, this
is a hatchery to keep the species alive.
Good.
Yeah.
Life support. Okay.
And I just want to highlight what you mentioned because it's not highlighted enough, and that is how much the people who do this work care about the fish. We don't talk about that enough. And it needs to be talked about when we get into fights and arguments over regulation and the government and, whatever we're not allowed to do because of the Endangered Species Act or how much money it's going to cost. We don't talk about the people whose job it is to actually prevent a species from going extinct and that they're not getting paid very well. And they're doing it because they care about the fish more than anybody else. And I've seen, that passion, and I think if we don't supporting those people is just as important as trying to.
Yeah, because sometimes I'll be amazed. This is more on the marine side, but a lot of the commercial fishermen that I've met, I mean, they think there's this grand conspiracy against them,
Right.
and it's like, have you met any of these people who are doing this work? Because that's not what's going on here. This is not about you, man. This is about cod or whatever. All right, so. We were talking about sort of what went wrong. What's the kind of timeline and sort of a brief overview of what happened to this amazing fishery, right?
Yeah. So commercial fishing continued through the 19th century. There were still hatchery efforts. So declines were noted as soon as
But they were netting.
they were wares.
Oh, they were.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
So fixed nets or fences of brush and sticks that were set perpendicular to shore. I'm just bringing up another
It's like funneling
visual
the fish in.
for Daniel. Yes, they funnel the fish in.
And so they would rebuild this every season?
They would rebuild them. Yeah, because the ice, right, would knock them out. So every year in spring, the fishermen would put out their wear, and they all had their own design. So here's the photo. If you look at them, they're sort of a line that would go perpendicular, so a fence that would go perpendicular from shore. And then they would have some kind of an enclosure at the end, like a maze, so the fish would enter
funnel into that capture area.
Into the capture area. And every fisherman kind of had his own design.
Oh, okay.
And so the U.S. Fish Commission was really fascinated, and there was a lot of illustrations of the different designs. And there were, at the peak, 200 wares. So every little coastal riverfront riparian landowner would fish, and they fished as part of a seasonal cycle of occupation. So they'd make money from cutting wood, from making sap, and then from fishing in the spring.
Is there something people could search to find these images?
So if you just search Penobscot River salmon wear, you'll get images of them.
This is also available online, is it not? Your slideshow, or
probably
the
somewhere.
talk that you did with that. I'll put a link to the talk where you go through these materials.
That would be great.
Yeah.
So the salmon wear. So every little hash mark is a wear. So there'd be like 200 just in the Penobscot alone.
Okay.
So they were fished. The hatchery was up and running because they already knew that fish were declining. But dams continued to be built, and then with the emergence of both pulp and paper technology and hydroelectric generating technology, new dams were built and existing dams were rebuilt to generate electricity. And so there was this like flurry of dam construction on the river.
So there was like a period of time where everybody was super hot for dams.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so hundreds went up.
Wow.
And so that was the biggest factor affecting salmon up until about 1930.
And I read somewhere in here this morning that you were saying that a lot of our anadromous fish don't push so deep into the mainland, right? So they were less affected by the dams higher up the river, but salmon need that entire river.
Salmon and eel, actually, they travel the farthest. Okay. So salmon need the super fast, super cold, tiny, tributaries running off of the slopes of Katahdin. That's where they want to spawn because it's the closest they can come to a glacier. So
that's amazing.
So they need the farthest. They need the most habitat. So they need those upper headwater streams.
It's where the water has the most oxygen.
Has a lot of oxygen, and it's a good place to raise their young because the fewest predators.
They're escaping predators is the current thinking, right? That's why they do this?
That's what people think.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
So that's why they were so impacted, because they were cut off from their spawning. They can't spawn in salt water, and they're really picky. Like, they want to get back to the stream where they were born. So they're not just going to go anywhere. They want to get back home, to their specific home. So they were really impacted.
Okay.
So we had commercial fishing in the dams, and then as the pulp and paper industry sort of began to mature, pollution started to accumulate in the rivers
From their processing.
from making paper.
You're talking about like metals and other.
Mostly organic waste
okay.
that uses oxygen as it's decomposed in the water. So it's oxygen demand.
But that's coming out of smokestacks? Or
it's coming out of wastewater discharge.
Okay, understood.
So to make paper, you need a lot of water.
Yeah.
And then you mash up the tree pulp with a ton of water and sulfur and other kind of chemicals to get it mashed and leach it and bleach it, and then chlorine. And then all of that water then drains out. The pulp
Pour that out in the river.
And goes directly into the river.
Also, there was a time, like today, trucking seems like how they get the logs out, but there was a time where they were pushing them down the rivers, right? And there's so much remnant. I mean, where we live, Grant, there's so many of those locks that you see, all those lakes, like in our area, aren't natural lakes. They were, rivers that have been locked up and made into, but they originally were pushing logs through there, right?
And that's more organic waste. So the river was also full of bark and sawdust and logs.
Okay.
And some of the first clean water legislation was about regulating sawmill waste. Okay. So all of this pulp and paper wastewater was on top of all of that sawmill waste, bark and sawdust and logs. Organic, so a lot of organic matter, and then population increases.
Say human organic matter too.
With
at that
wastewater,
time.
And
it must have been disgusting.
It was disgusting, and nobody wanted to go near. I mean, we haven't even talked about angling yet, but no one wanted to go near the river.
I bet you could. It must have stunk.
So the best,
bad.
It was so bad. So if we think about in 1960. In 1960, if you look at the Penobscot River watershed, there were 150,000 people living in the watershed. That's how many people were here. But the waste load was equivalent to 5 million people living in the watershed.
That's amazing, because Maine's population isn't anywhere near 5 million.
But that's how much waste was in the river. And it was,
at today's standards, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And the majority of it was pulp and paper wastewater.
So at this point now, not only do we have the physical impediments of the structures that have been erected on the watershed, but we also have a wall of sewage and industrial runoff that these fish also would have to navigate.
And no oxygen.
No oxygen.
They couldn't breathe. And so that was the 50s and 60s were really the low point for lower than today for salmon.
Because a lot of the people who are listening right now are, again, it's like that shifting baseline idea. There's so many things that are in place now, or ideas that make so much sense now that didn't make sense then, right? So we, having grown up in a milieu where the environment is talked about so constantly, I think people might not realize like how bad things, like why we have such a big environmental movement now.
Yeah. So I have this graph of salmon returns that starts in 1960, and there's no fish. And then if you look at the environmental legislation that started to be passed beginning in the 1960s, and you can see it actually having an effect on the fish really, really quickly. So things like the Clean Water Act, things like the Environmental Policy Act that created the Environmental Protection Agency, funding to build new hatcheries and support the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. All of these things, the federal government actually designated the Penobscot a model river for if we're going to do salmon restoration anywhere, this is where it's going to happen. And within like a decade, all of that legislation, the water was cleaned up and the fish came back.
It's amazing. Okay.
Like really quickly. And the Clean Water Act never gets enough credit. I mean, that was the single biggest thing that has helped salmon.
Okay. It's because it's run in the background for so long, though, right? It's like, or at least that'd be my impression. It's like
50 years, yeah.
There's a generation of people who didn't grow up around that. It's
right.
take it for granted.
Right. Know? We've lost memory of rivers. Like I think that people still look at a river, especially an urban river, and associate it with pollution. They don't know what kind of pollution, but there's just like this correlation that somehow rivers are all polluted. But we don't know really where that, it's like this legacy of a time when they actually were polluted.
Sure.
And the fact that they're cleaned up, that story just hasn't really been told.
Right. What is the overlay of the story of this fish and these presidents? Because that I think is such a neat part of this book, and something that I had never heard about. I just never heard about that. Everybody I've brought it up to has never heard about that. So
Which is crazy.
So why is this book called The President's Salmon?
So there was also a really pretty major sport or recreational fishery, fly fishing for salmon on the Penobscot River.
Very gentlemanly.
Yes.
Well, it wasn't just men, though, obviously. It seems like there was quite a lot of
It was women and
female anglers,
children
too.
also fished, and it was really popular right here in Bangor and Brewer. So the Penobscot Salmon Club was the first salmon fishing club in the United States. It was built in 1887. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. You can see it right across the river from Eastern Maine Medical Center. Still a group of people that are trying hard to preserve it.
They're still at it. Wow.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so it was local people fishing, but it was also people from all over New England and Canada that would come to fish.
Was it then at that time not just, because today fly fishing has become, Grant and I were talking about it on the drive here. I was saying, well, it's kind of, fly fishing is a bit of a kind of upper class pursuit, but now it's also a bit of a hipster pursuit too. So it's kind of both of those going on. At this time, was it like that, or was it, because were the locals who were involved in it sort of the salt of the earth folks?
Working class. Oh yeah, they were working class people. So everyone
So
fished.
it's different world, fly fishing then, different world than
Different
sort
world.
of what emerged out of it later.
It was like recreation, what you did for fun.
Okay.
And also, like a lot of them, they ate the fish that they caught. So it wasn't just about recreation, but for a lot of people, I think it was subsistence as well. And so the first fish that was caught every year was like a big deal. The newspapers would report on it. Anglers would sell their fish to local markets and make money. And so there was like competition.
That's
like
neat that the newspaper would report
Oh
on
yeah,
that.
and people competed. Like certain hotels, they wanted to be able to brag that they were serving the first fish. Wealthy people wanted to be able to purchase the first fish.
Still going on with bluefin in Japan.
Yeah,
right?
so there was prestige. There was prestige in it. And so one year it was actually a Norwegian immigrant named Carl Anderson who was a house painter, and he lived right in Bangor. He could walk down to the Bangor Salmon Pool and row his peapod across the river to the Salmon Club. And so he caught the first fish that year. So opening day was April 1st. As soon as the ice, even before the ice went out, they would be out there on April 1st starting to fish. And so he caught the first fish. He caught 2 fish on opening day. And the first fish went to Campbell Clark, who owned the Clark Thread Company in Newark, New Jersey. And he often paid the most money to get the first fish. And then the other fish, Carl decided to send it to the President of the United States. The Bangor Republicans had just had a convention and supported William Howard Taft in his bid for re-election. So that must have been on Carl's mind. He must have been a Republican, and he said, I'm going to send this fish to the president.
The idea of that today, if I want to box this fish up and the president's definitely going to eat it, it's no, that's never going to happen. It's not making it through security.
Yep. So they packed the fish up in ice and put it in a crate and shipped it overnight on the train to D.C. to William Howard Taft. And so that became an annual tradition where every year the first fish was sent to the President of the United States.
That's so cool. And this went on from 80 years, right?
Yep. So 1912, there was a gap when the river was so polluted that there was no fishing.
Right.
So there was actually a gap. It wasn't continuous.
Okay.
But when the fish came back in 1980, the anglers decided to revive the tradition. And so in the 1980s and 90s, it continued as well.
Okay. And then it went right up to Father George, right? George H.W.
Yes. 1992.
I'm trying to remember that part of that. I read the book, it was a while ago now. Don't think it was received in quite the same way or, so well received with him, or was it sort of by then was the tradition kind of just forgotten or what?
Well, it was definitely a formality. So in the book, I revisit. I use that as a narrative structure throughout the book, and so I kind of visit each president who received a salmon. I kind of try to revisit that scene of who caught the fish, how was it delivered? How was it received by the president? What was the ceremony like? Did the president eat it? Did the president like fish? I kind of use it as a way to look at the presidents, which was really fun and a great way to learn a lot of American history that I did not know. And so by the time of 1992, it was a big formality. Like you'd catch the fish and then all the congressional delegation would have to get involved. It was like really political and a lot of sort of posturing and just like red tape to make it happen. And in fact, in 1993, there was a fish ready to go to the president. And it just like, it took so long. It was sitting in Scott Westfall's freezer and he was just like, screw it, I'm eating it. And so he ate it with he ate it and he and his dog ate the fish. And he was the son of Claude Westfall, who was the one who then ended up being the one who caught the last presidential salmon.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. And no one since then has done it.
Well, then this fish were proposed for listing under the Endangered Species Act.
That's
So the fishery went to catch and release, and then so
So
it died kind of because of it just got to be too onerous and to deliver the fish, and then regulations kicked in that just prevented it from being able to happen.
I want to make sure that we come back to talking about what it looks like to fish salmon here now, but I want to also talk about at that, because when you're talking about what's happened here, my mind goes to, well, okay, what if we go up further into Nova Scotia? What's it like in Iceland? What's it like in Greenland? Are there places where the fishery's still good? And that kind of leads me to this. Prior to ocean fishing of them, all the fishing was happening when they would come back and return to their native waters. But then there was like sort of the discovery made about where they were going, right? What happened then?
So that was in the 1960s.
My heart sank when I read that.
Yeah.
I did. I really I have moments where it's like, well, why even go on?
Yeah.
What's the point of living?
Yeah. I actually, to be honest, I don't know that. Like, there are other people that know this part of the story much better than I do. But there were, and it's funny because at the same time as scientists were doing the tagging to try to discover where fish went, was around the same time that people in Greenland, like someone, caught salmon in a net.
Pulled up a net and was like, whoa.
Yeah. And so that, like the details of that, I don't know. But it was all around the same time and had to do partly with Denmark, trying to ramp up the Greenland economy.
Okay.
So people were fishing farther from shore. And then the Faroe Islands, so people, started fishing, I guess, where they hadn't been fishing with nets before. And, at the surface, because salmon swim at the surface as opposed to ground fish. So, and all of a sudden we can catch salmon in the ocean.
So they're in the upper water column during their time in the ocean.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Why no one ever caught a salmon in a net at sea before? It's kind of a.
They picked a good spot.
I guess.
Held out for a while.
And so immediately people then started fishing, putting big nets out at sea and catching salmon on their wintering waters.
Okay. And so that must have had a tremendous impact too on returns.
Yeah, and it's hard to tell because the hatcheries were ramping up at the same time, and so it's hard to tell, but it has certainly had an impact.
To your knowledge, is there anywhere where there's like still pristine intact runs, or has it been caught up everywhere in their northern range?
Maybe Iceland.
Yep. Wow, it's really like a kind of a sad story. So
is anybody fishing that anymore?
So you can fly fish for salmon in Canada. You can
and Iceland too. Iceland has
Iceland
charter trips and stuff.
And Scotland, Scotland they still fish for salmon, and Ireland, although Scotland. So, but the problem is that Atlantic salmon throughout their range, U.S., Canada, Europe, Iceland, they're declining everywhere. Mm-hmm. So that's how we know that it's something in the ocean. Because they all congregate. So all of those different rivers, the fish from different rivers mix during the winter when they're at sea. They all sort of come together on these feeding grounds, and then that's where they're being fished. And the marine environment is changing because of climate change. And so something is happening that's affecting them across their range.
Okay.
As well as still having issues in the river.
And then what's the status now? Or maybe just take us through what happened once they were listed with the ESA, and then where's it at now?
I'm going back to my charts. So they were listed in 1999, and then the listing was expanded in 2009. And so they started coming back in the 1970s, and then the 80s was really this boom time. Like the 80s were great. And then the early 90s is when they started to decline, and that is linked to ocean conditions. So there was a lot going on in the North Atlantic and Arctic in the early 1990s. Scientists call it a regime shift, where essentially the food web, there was like some trophic cascades and the food web shifted, where there was a whole bunch of meltwater from the Arctic that was really cold and dense, and it affected sort of stratification, and it led to different species of phytoplankton, which meant different species of zooplankton.
Totally disrupts the whole thing from the bottom up.
And it affected cod and other fish that eat smaller fish were affected. So that affected salmon as well. And so they're still kind of recovering from that. So other parts of the ocean food web have recovered, but salmon and cod just have not recovered as quickly. So you can sort of see variation, and historically it varied year to year, the returns. It wasn't consistently 10,000
yeah, because you
or
get
100,000
like this one really
fish.
good one in the 2000s. Even.
Right. Yeah, 2011, there were over 3,000 that came back. That's been the best year since the 80s.
But still down from 100,000, you said, I think, right?
Well, still down from their historic natural high, and even from the few thousand fish per year at the turn of the 20th century. But they're still here. So we had almost 800 come back last year. I mean, they're still here. They're still in the river.
Wow, 800 last year.
They're still surviving, and that's not bad.
They're still here.
It's crazy that's not bad.
Well, it's not bad. So they need 500. The hatchery needs 500 to maintain the population. Like that's the life support level is 500 adult fish.
So only 300 of those are not being taken back into the hatchery?
Right.
Wow.
To do what we were referring to yesterday as squeeze the tube of toothpaste.
Yes. And there have been some pilots of holding the adult fish in the hatchery to make sure they stay alive, and then when spawning season comes, bringing them to the rivers and bringing them up into their habitat and letting them spawn naturally. Okay. There have been some experiments with that.
Yeah, have there been any years recently where they didn't have 300 to take back?
It was pretty low. So, there's been years when they had fewer
But what's
5
happening
than
with all
500.
what's
500,
happening with all of the salmon fry grow up and leave again? No.
Yes.
Where they're not coming back when they get
Right. They're not coming back. So
Maybe they get eaten, or
So they're not coming back, and so a couple things are going on. One is the ones that are stocked in the headwaters still have a bunch of dams to get over.
Yeah.
There is predation. I don't know if there's hundreds of cormorants in the river right now, and they're eating salmon smolts.
Oh.
And that's fine unless you have fewer than 500, fish. Anything that affects them is a concern at this level of population. But mostly scientists think it's something going on in the ocean. So marine survival.
That's not like we're just trying to put the blame over here. That's like sounds legitimate to you.
It sounds it's legitimate. Okay. But it doesn't take away from the effort. Like we can really do something in freshwater, and we should still do everything we can. The more fish we get out of the rivers, the more will come back. Mm-hmm. So we still have to make sure that the river is good habitat.
Okay. So today, if somebody wants to fish, now I fish salmon in the winter, but obviously fish that were stocked, landlocked salmon. Is there still a catch and release fishery for returning salmon?
No.
Okay, because you said something earlier about catch and release, and I was like, no, it can't be.
No.
You can't touch these fish, right?
You cannot touch these fish.
Don't look at them.
You don't look at them.
How do they avoid incidental catch? Are you not? Is
Well,
it closed during certain times here?
That's a very good question. So there was some catch and release fishing in 2006, 2007, 2008.
I need to consult the numbers. How was it then?
It was experimental.
No, they were good years.
And
though.
the Endangered Species Act listing had not yet been expanded to include more of all of the Penobscot. It was only a tributary to the Penobscot.
Where? Okay, so at this point, how expanded is it?
So now Atlantic salmon in the whole state of Maine.
Okay.
It's the whole state of Maine, essentially.
And they're not going anywhere else anyway.
So it's the Kennebec population, the Penobscot population, and then the down
But that's
east
the
rivers.
southern. Maine is the southernmost.
Yes.
Right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
What was the question?
The question is like, how are they?
Where can you fish
protecting-
for them?
Yeah.
So-
and how are they preventing incidental catch?
So there is no angling allowed for Atlantic salmon. There are some signs posted, like in in streams where people are angling to help people identify Atlantic salmon. So there's a little bit of education effort, but I think it's going to become a bigger issue because the restoration project, while salmon are still struggling, other fish are coming back. So we have millions of alewife in the river, and we've got thousands of shad. And shad are really fun to fish for. And this could be and people are fishing for shad. And when people fish for shad, you could catch a salmon.
Okay.
And it's not really, people are not talking about it really, but it's happening. And I think, I really want to fish for shad, but I don't want to catch a salmon, and so I'd rather just not do. I'm so afraid of catching a salmon.
It's crazy because there's things that there's bag limits and restrictions that sometimes you feel like I feel like they could expand our turkey limits a little bit right now. Having met with the migratory bird biologist for the state, he sort of mentioned it. And, sometimes when I can take 2 birds, it's like, man, I wish I could take another one. But then there's other things like this where every fish is actually extremely important, right? When you're getting down to these numbers.
Every fish matters, and they can't handle, we don't need to add to their stress.
The pressure,
They have a lot of stress.
Oh, yeah.
And
The actual physical stress of being hooked
so
and caught and
we
reeled
don't
around.
need to add to that. So that we can have fun. It's just not really. So there are places, so I think just being mindful of where you are fishing and what time of year.
What happens what are you supposed to do if you catch one? You must have to notify somebody from the department.
Get it back in the river as quick as you
right
can.
away, right? Oh my goodness. It's like accidentally hooking into I remember one time seeing a buddy of mine hook into a seal accidentally. And we were like, oh, what do you do now?
And I will say, so I went out with shad researchers a couple years ago on the river, and we were electrofishing, and we saw there were salmon out there. And
came up?
It was the first time. No, not that we're electrofish. We saw them leaping, and so it's like the boat, it gets shut off immediately, and we go to a different part of the river.
Right.
But it was the first time I'd ever seen a wild Atlantic salmon.
Yeah.
In the river, not being stalked, but actually.
Because there's something
migrating.
about when I catch a salmon, there's something about. There's some kind of nostalgic thing for me. I know this is a domesticated fish, essentially, right? I'm dealing with. It's there's something really sad there for me and something that I'm grateful for. It's like a mixed emotion because the idea of the whole world being so tamed.
Yeah, but the landlocked salmon are derived from the Sebago population, and that's a native wild population that they come from.
Yeah.
So, I wouldn't feel too
but
bad
I do
about
kind of
it.
see, but I do see where
that's so
they're.
nice.
Yeah, I know. I guess I was joking yesterday with the hatchery specialist. I was like, man, how do you think it would affect deer hunting if you knew that all the deer had started off being raised in pens, they were raised first, there was a tube kind of thing, an artificial, conception, and then raised in a pen and then released out there, I don't think the hunting numbers would be what they are because there's something about knowing. I think there's something in humans who are so domesticated now that we want this connection back to wild things and wild places. And so knowing that my salmon, started off in one of these hatcheries isn't my most favorite thing. But like you said, knowing it's a connection back to something that's heritage means a lot to me. And so I do like to fish for them. But I've never seen a wild Atlantic salmon, and I feel like where I live, that's a weird thing.
Yeah.
That's a sad kind of weird outcome. But how do you, I guess I want to ask well, first let me ask you this. What kind of concluding thoughts do you have about this fish that you want to leave people with? Because here you call in your subtitle, the king of fish, which I think is a really appropriate name for this fish. At least, it's deserving of the title. There's so much to say, but I don't know, in conclusion, what are your thoughts?
Well, what I say when I do presentations, often is that, and what I learned from writing the book, which I think speaks to your mission with WildFed, is that when you're engaging with an animal or a plant, or when you're procuring your own food from the wild, you have a sense, about your environment, and so the people who were fishing, they knew the river the best. So the Penobscot Nation, who are the river, who are engaging with the river on a daily basis, whose culture is based on the river, they know the river, and so they're going to speak out and protect it, and there's that relationship there. The salmon anglers who are catching fish, all of these people are the ones who helped make it so that we could have a Penobscot restoration project. And they're the reasons why we have a Clean Water Act. And they're the reason why the river is as healthy today. They're the reason why we still have salmon in the Penobscot at all. And so, you might not have salmon in your local river, but you should still get to know your local river, and you should find out what fish are in it, learn its history, go walk along the river, and just sort of try to develop that relationship, even if it can't be sort of food-based.
I was looking at your bio today on the drive up here, and
You did a lot on the drive up here.
It's a long drive. I do a lot of research on the drive. I was noticing that it's funny, right? It's embarrassing. I just turned pink. I was noticing that you talked about how you write and lecture on, I want to say you said like nature, science, ecology, and place. And that grabbed me when you said place, because that's how we look at our project as well. The idea of helping people to be not just engage with place, but be made out of their place. And that's what's so important to me about this. And I thought it was really cool that you kind of echoed a similar sentiment. When you look out at place, because you're very ecologically educated, how are you... you mentioned seeing the cormorants out there, for instance. There's so much that people don't see that's happening around them, right? Because they haven't been initiated into it in some way, or haven't been educated on it. For you, knowing some of the history and what historically it was like, and seeing the condition of things today, like how do you deal with that emotionally? Because it's kind of a downer sometimes, right? Like we have these little success stories where it's like, no, there's 8,000 now. Like, okay, it's like great, but it's like, oh man, it's still down so much. And if it was just that one story, but it's like almost every story, right? And how do you not lose your mind over that?
I'm still figuring it out.
Okay. Damn, I was hoping for an answer.
No, I think I'm struggling with, like these great success stories. So there are more fish in the Penobscot River now than there have been in over 100 years.
Wow.
And that's pretty amazing. But then if you look at everything that's gotten worse, I think and I actually started making this list, and I asked my friends, like, what's better, what's worse, what's the same from 25 years ago? And I'm kind of scared to do the exercise of compiling it all, because I'm scared that the what's worse is going to be longer. But maybe, I think something about making that list is how I'm trying to figure it out. And the other thing that I'm on, so it's International Year of the Salmon. I don't know if you knew that, but 2019 is International Year of the Salmon.
Wow. Who decided that?
Pacific Science Research Agencies, and then it's a global initiative, so it's salmon worldwide. So the book is getting a little bit of attention, just purely by coincidence. I had no idea
congratulations,
when I wrote the book that this International Year of the Salmon was coming up. So I've been doing a lot of presentations. And, every time I do one, I kind of retool it and think about it. And so lately, and I think the one you saw might have been at the New England Aquarium, maybe.
You were followed by a Penobscot woman. No, by a Passamaquoddy woman.
So that was at the New England Aquarium. Okay. So, and I think that, this connects to what you're trying to do as well. The idea that our culture used to be nature-based, right? So all of our cultural traditions, our literature, our art, our recreation was all based on nature. And I'm afraid that we're getting away from that. We don't look to nature for song lyrics, we're just getting away from that because we're so surrounded either by the built environment or by the computer environment, or, kind of social and political and human things. And I think somehow remembering that nature is a source of culture and that we're a part of nature is part of the way forward, and looking to nature for that kind of inspiration as well as sustenance.
You think that salmon will be here in 100 years? These salmon?
I don't know if salmon will be here. Atlantic salmon will still be somewhere. They'll still be. They are survivors. They've survived ice ages. But I don't know if they'll be here. But making a river, using salmon as your ideal and your goal,
benefits the entire.
It benefits
ecosystem
everybody.
regardless. Any questions, Grant?
No, I just appreciate you coming on. It's a really interesting story.
I could ask these like little questions forever, but tell people about your other books and also where they can find. We're going to put up all this stuff, of course, associated that we've talked about and links to your webpage and everything, but just tell people overview of what else you have out there and where they can find you.
Sure. I have 2 other books, A Coastal Companion, A Year in the Gulf of Maine, From Cape Cod to Canada.
That's a cool book. Describe that book.
It's kind of an almanac for the Gulf of Maine. It's not tied to any specific year, but there's an entry for every day of the year, and it chronicles, what's happening with birds, with fish, with plants blooming,
It's like a journal of the unfolding of the season. Right?
Yep.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Circulation in the Gulf of Maine, and it also has poems and illustrations by Maine artists. And there's historical, like a standard almanac. So I cover sort of historical events of coastal scientists and other coastal writers and artists throughout the Gulf of Maine. And then my most recent book is Historic Acadia National Park, which came out in 2016.
Came out right on the back of this book. How'd you do that?
I had a busy couple of years.
Yeah, I bet. This was 2015, right? And then 2016?
Yep.
Yeah, I was like, wow, I couldn't do that. And where do people find you? Are you on social media at all? Or are you primarily through your webpage?
Yep, my website and Twitter.
Awesome. We'll put up links to
Instagram,
that.
Facebook.
Oh, you're doing the whole gamut.
Yep.
Oh, man.
I use them all a little differently.
That's like a whole nother factor to deal with. Thank you so much for meeting with us. Thank you for the work that you've done on salmon. I just really appreciate. I'm not somebody who's going to go through and read what you read to write this book. So for me, this book was a summary of a lot of things and got me up to speed. So thank you, and thanks for taking the time today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. You can help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh, new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out the WildFed video show and store. WildFed. Food is all around you.